Survival kits are for amateurs. Yeah, it's a big call, and I don't really mean it, but it seemed like a catchy title for this video. Despite that, the fact is that you should be carrying pretty much all your survival essentials anyway without having to have a dedicated survival kit. Now, I don't consider myself to be a survival expert, but in this video I'm talking about the priorities for survival and how you probably already pack most of the items you need for survival. Okay, let's get after it. Welcome back to Wayfinder Field Skills. To start on today's topic, I'm going to go over the basic principles for survival and then look at the gear you're probably already carrying and where it fits in the principles of survival. When talking survival, a common theme is the rule of threes. This usually means the three big priorities for bush survival: shelter, water, food, in that order. What that means is that you can reasonably survive in most environments for 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. And it is a good rule of thumb when prioritising for survival that you should first seek shelter, then a source of water, and worry about food later. Obviously it's not that simple. In a desert environment you will need shelter from the elements pretty quick, but you'll also need a water source. But in a tropical rainforest you may not need the shelter so urgently, but you will need water soon. I've also heard air being put in the rule of threes. That is, 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. Well, that's biologically correct more or less, but for bush survival I think the need for air doesn't really need to be mentioned. Another priority that is important though is direction finding, because unless you want to camp in one location and wait for survival, which might be the best plan, then you need to figure out which direction you plan to move to get to help and safety. So I like to think about bush survival priorities as being shelter, water, food, and a means of navigation. Now the fact is, you probably carry most, if not all, the equipment you need to cater to those priorities on any hike longer than a couple of hours. Let's start with shelter. For a day hike, most people take a jumper or a rain jacket. For any sort of longer overnight or multi-day hike, you'll be carrying a sleep system of some sort. In other words, most of us have some sort of basic shelter requirements with us any time we go more than a couple of hours into the bush. Should the worst happen and you get caught out with only a jumper, then you'll need to consider what your shelter requirements are for the conditions you're in. Even in the tropics it can be cold at night, especially if there's wind or bad weather. So you'll want to look for a way to get out of the wind. This might be all you need to do in a warm environment. But for most parts of the planet, you also need to think about staying warm. And this could be as simple as gathering up a big pile of leaves and burrowing into them, or as complex as constructing a shelter or lean-to and building a fire. Fire is something that bears mention. Unless you have a lot of skill in making fire from scratch, then something like rubbing sticks together is virtually mission impossible. So even on day trips, you might want to think about packing a lighter or some way to make fire. Obviously you can survive without fire, but it could mean the difference between a night out being an ordeal of shivering as you listen to every single rustle in the night, or it being an unplanned night sleeping outdoors you can tell your kids about later. Next, water. Once again, anything more than a couple of hours and I'd be surprised if you weren't carrying water. For longer hikes and multi-day trips, then yeah, you're going to have some sort of a plan for maintaining your water supply. This could be as simple as filling up at campsites along the way, and if that is your plan, then you should also be considering your need and method to purify the water. I've done another video all about water purification and I'll put a link in the description below. In the event that somehow you get lost or stranded in the bush, then water quickly becomes a real consideration. In my opinion, for any longer trip you should be carrying a means to purify questionable water sources, and for day trips or shorter outings I always carry a little more water than I absolutely need. It's beyond the scope of this video to go into all the ways to find or manufacture water if there isn't any readily available. And to be honest, in some environments, like a desert, you just might not be able to get enough water to maintain your survival for a long period of time. And in that case, you would need to think about how to minimise your water needs or losses. So this probably goes back to shelter requirements, so staying out of the sun and out of the wind, both of which will dry you out, and don't travel in the heat of the day, so on and so forth. Okay, so food. Your requirements for shelter and water are much more pressing than the need for food, And aside from what you might be carrying with you, I think that if you ever find yourself in a survival situation, then make sure you have your shelter and water needs dialed before you worry about food. Also, unless you have expert knowledge of local edible plants and fishing or hunting equipment, then the effort to hunt and gather, plus the risk of poisoning, probably makes these activities not worth it in the first at least 3 to 4 days of a survival nightmare. For some people this might be a bit of a mental adjustment, but you really can survive a long time without food. It sucks, trust me, but even the leanest person has weeks of energy stored as fat. The next thing is getting back to civilization. If it is possible for you to travel, i.e. you can manage your shelter and water requirements on the move, then the next thing you'll have to worry about is how to maintain your direction. There are a few considerations here. One of which is, do you need to travel? Now, unless you have just survived a plane crash or been swept ashore from a shipwreck or some other extreme event, then it's likely you have some idea of where you are. As an example, if I was hiking in the mountains of the southwest Tasmania and got lost, then the big picture for me is that all civilization is to my north and east, and the closest farms and towns are to the east. Now, my first priority in terms of direction finding would be to try and find the walking track again or some recognisable landmark. But should I make the decision to try to walk out of there, then I would likely be walking east. So my priority is to find east. This is easy initially as the sun rises in the east, so early in the day I can face the sun, and late in the day I can have the sun at my back. And that goes into the next consideration. How do I maintain my direction? Early in the day and later in the day it's pretty easy to maintain a rough direction as the sun is in the east or the west. But during the middle of the day it can be harder unless you have a compass or know how to find direction with your watch or have a good landmark to follow. And it's probably worth resting through the middle of the day and maybe foraging for food and water at this time. If you do decide to move, then I can't overemphasise the need to be able to set a direction and follow it, as without something to keep you on course, you will walk in a circle. A man called Frederick Lund did research in the 1930s that showed that 55% of people turn to the right and 45% turn to the left, and this is mostly due to differences in leg length. In short, if you're not confident to find a direction and stick to it, then you're likely to wander in circles, and this has caused the demise of many a hiker. If you're still watching, then you're probably starting to wonder what my point is. I said right at the start that survival kits are for amateurs. I guess what I really meant is that you should be carrying what you need for survival with you anyway, and that it is knowing how to use what you have that is more important than having a little tin full of fish hooks and some water purification tablets, though these are both very useful things to carry. Now, if I was to make any sort of recommendations, first and foremost, always tell someone where you are going and when you plan to be back. And if you're just going for a couple of hours, then make sure to take a water bottle and a jumper. If it's a day walk, then add in a compass and a pocket knife. For anything overnight or longer, then you really should have shelter equipment, some means to make a fire, a first aid kit, and a way to collect safe water. The next thing is, don't leave your pack and walk off on some side tour to have a look at a site, for half a day, as this is where you're most likely to run in trouble should something happen. It doesn't matter what sort of cool gear you've got stashed in your pack if it's 6 kilometres away. The only survival gear that can help you is what you have on you. One final piece of advice that I have, and that I've received over the years, is that if you're ever lost, then before you do anything, sit down, have a cup of tea or a snack, or just sit down for a few minutes and consider your situation. Slow and steady wins the race, as they say. Remember your priorities: shelter, water, food, and finding the right direction to travel if able. And don't forget that before you even leave home, you should tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. As an example, my mother often goes on multi-day hikes in the Tasmanian bushland, and she always sends me a text telling me where she's going and when she'll be back. She also sends me a message when she gets back, otherwise I'd be freaking right out, right? Okay, if you managed to get this far, I hope that you found this interesting and informative. Please give the video a like, and if you want to see more of me, then hit the subscribe button. If there's anything you'd like me to do in a video in future, then leave me a suggestion in comments. Thanks very much for watching, and have a nice day.